Let me start this discussion with the core issue. Not politics, not ideology, but principle. Let's talk about sovereignty. Sovereignty means an independent country gets to decide who it associates with, who it trades with, who it trains its people with, and who it allows to work within its borders. And what's happening now with St. Lucia raises a simple but uncomfortable question. If a country is deemed to be a sovereign nation, why is it being told who it can and cannot engage with? Now, let's be clear. St. Lucia is not the target. It's basically the pawn. St. Lucia is not the target here. St. Lucia is the pressure point. The United States of America is pressuring St. Lucia to stop sending medical students to Cuba for training. Stop employing Cuban workers, Cuban professionals across key sectors. The stated justification is moral. Cuban workers are allegedly underpaid. They are allegedly coerced. The Cuban state allegedly benefits disproportionately when it has its workers work in other countries. This is the argument being presented. But the deeper objective is not St. Lucia's policies here. The objective is to tighten maximum pressure on Cuba, and St. Lucia is being used as the guinea pig to help to enforce this objective by the Trump administration. Here's a principle that cannot be ignored. St. Lucia does not tell the United States who to trade with. It does not have the audacity to tell the United States who to buy oil from. It does not tell the US which countries are acceptable partners. And St. Lucia could never do that because the United States is a sovereign nation that operates of its own volition. If you're a sovereign country, you do what you want to do because you're an independent country. So, does the same standard apply in reverse as it relates to St. Lucia and the US? If St. Lucia is independent, then St. Lucia gets to decide whether it engages Cuba, whether it allows Cuban workers to work in this country, whether it sends its St. Lucian student to Cuba for medical training. Not because Washington approves, but because that is what sovereignty actually means. You cannot claim that you have a respect for sovereignty while overriding it or when it suits your needs. Even if you accept that workers' protection matters, and frankly, in my view, they do, there's a glaring omission in the US's position. Glaring omission. And where's the alternative? St. Lucia is not being offered by the US a US-funded medical training pipeline, regional medical schools, replacement healthcare workers, economic compensation. Instead, St. Lucia is being told by the US, remove the doctors, remove the educators, remove the professional workers, and somehow figure out a way to fill that gap alone. That is not reform. That is removal without replacement, and it is by design. And St. Lucia understands something crucial here. It is a very small nation. And while one voice can be silenced, if it can put together a consortium, for example, all the Caribbean nations, it'd be much harder to ignore. That is why St. Lucia is not just merely asking for help from its Caribbean nations. It is calling for a collective CARICOM response. Because when you defend sovereignty together, it carries much more weight than sovereignty asserted alone. Now, this is where the conversation really turns. The US is arguing that Cuba is an authoritarian regime. No disputing that. Been happening since what? The late 50s under Castro. It also arguing that it lacks political freedom and that this justifies the pressure it's applying to engineer, in my view, a change in government. That claim is not new. But here's the problem. If authoritarianism was the true standard, it should be and would be applied consistently. And frankly, it isn't. The United States has a long-standing relationship with governments that do not hold free or fair elections, come to power through military intervention, restrict dissent and political opposition. That is a fact. Egypt came to power when the Muslim Brotherhood was overthrown by the military, get US support in terms of aid. US trades with China, authoritarian regime. US have arms sales to Saudi Arabia, authoritarian regime. When you provide military aid, arms sales, diplomacy, legitimacy, engagement, trade, sales, then it isn't about Cuba and its authoritarian regime. It's about acknowledging selective fairness, where moral standards are enforced against some countries and quietly ignored for others based on strategic interests. That matters because once morality becomes selective, it stops being moral and becomes tactical. This pressure is not unique to Cuba or St. Lucia. We have seen the same pattern. Countries warned about buying Russian oil. We see India agreeing with the US to stop buying Russian oil and to get their tariff reduced. Countries warned about deepening ties with China. See that happen with Jamaica. Panama pressured over Chinese port contracts. We see a court in Panama recently canceled a contract with a Chinese company or a Hong Kong company. And a lot of Caribbean nations I mentioned, like Jamaica, cautioned and other countries about engaging with China and about China investment. In the Western Hemisphere, especially, this increasingly resembles a quiet revival of an old idea that this region is the US sphere of control, not a collection of equals. Many would recognize this as a modern echo of the Monroe Doctrine, not announced, but enforced. Now let's talk about who actually pays the price. It's not government, it's people. Many Cubans, as we know, especially the ones who have migrated, do not like their government. That's definitely true. But when you cut off the oil from Venezuela that Cuba got at discount, when electricity in Cuba becomes unreliable, when fuel shortages cripple daily lives, hospitals suffer, food shortage prevails, transportation collapses. And history shows something sobering. When the US runs a country into the ground, it does not help to rebuild it. It isolates it, it sanctions it, and it watches its falling apart. Go look at Libya, where the US encouraged the overthrowing of Gaddafi. And where's Libya now? Conflict, endless war. But that is what maximum pressure looks like in human terms. You destroy the country with various means, and then you don't provide investment, you don't provide support, you don't help that country recovers and help itself. So let's return to St. Lucia, a small nation being told to participate in a pressure campaign it did not design, absorb economic risk it cannot afford, and undermine its own healthcare system. All the while knowing tourism depends heavily on US travelers. Economic retaliation doesn't need to be loud. Pressure doesn't need to be formal to be effective. This is not choice. This is coercion wrapped in diplomacy. Let me close where we began. If sovereignty only applies to powerful countries, then sovereignty doesn't really exist. If the United States can choose who it engages with, then St. Lucia must be able to do the same. Otherwise, we're not talking about independent nations. We're talking about permission. Independent, that depends on permission, is not independence at all. That's what's really going on. St. Lucia doesn't have a choice, but I believe other nations have been put in the same situation. They just haven't come out and spoken out loud. If you'd like to see more videos like these, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. Peace out.